late afternoon light was soft in my bedroom. I was tidying up, trying to get my mind off the heavy thoughts that had been weighing on me for the past few days. At the back of my closet, hidden behind old boxes, I came across an item I'd long forgotten about. A large, brightly colored toy. Wiping it clean, I didn't even notice the door creak quietly open. Turning around, I already knew who was standing there: Calvin. His tall figure filled the doorway. He was wearing his usual jeans and stretchy t-shirt, and his blue eyes framed by dark hair stared straight at me. But something in his gaze was different, too focused, too intense. My heart stopped for a moment. A tension hung in the room, almost palpable. I hastily hid the toy behind my pillow and felt the blood rush to my face. All I could do was not look at him, but his presence was overwhelming. He didn't say a word, but his silence was more eloquent than any phrases. I could feel his gaze penetrating me, and it caused not only shame, but some strange, misplaced warmth that I tried to suppress. When he was finally gone, leaving behind only a painful memory, I sank down on the bed. The pillow was still pressed against my chest, and my thoughts were a seething storm. How could this have happened? Why was it exactly like this? The next few days were filled with nervous tension. Calvin acted as casually as usual, as if nothing had happened. He would come home late, laughing with his friends, drinking, sometimes playing music loudly. His behavior irritated me with its carelessness, but I couldn't deny that I noticed him more often now than before. Every time he appeared, I tensed up internally. I caught myself thinking about that night, about his gaze, about the strange silence that hung between us. And every day it became harder and harder to ignore. I tried to distract myself by loading myself up with housework, cooking, any little thing that could occupy my hands and thoughts. But it wasn't working. Even as I sat next to David, my husband, I could feel Calvin's shadow present somewhere nearby, invisible but tangible. One such evening, trying to avoid company, I took refuge in the kitchen. My head was throbbing with a pain that hadn't let up for hours. I tried to focus on my breathing, hoping the migraine would soon recede. Footsteps. Light, almost silent, they interrupted my solitude. Calvin walked in like a shadow, his movement unobtrusive but his presence unmistakable. He stopped at the sink, poured himself a glass of water, but didn't leave. I could feel his gaze on me without even lifting my head. The air between us was thick, as if filled with words neither of us dared to utter. My heart was beating too fast. The silence seemed louder than any sound, the headache intensified. The words I couldn't express seemed to throb in my temples along with the pain. I knew something inside me had changed, and whatever it was destroying me from the inside out. When I returned to the bedroom, David was already asleep. His breathing was even, calm. I sat down on the bed next to him, dropping my head into my palms. This situation, which I couldn't name or explain even to myself, was tearing me apart. I realized that this feeling was dangerous, destructive. It could destroy everything I had spent so long building. But instead of relief or clarity, all I felt was guilt and fear. His gaze resounded in my head. The one that had stopped on me that night. The one that was no longer the look of a son. And the only question echoing in my mind was, where had I gone wrong? I woke up before dawn. The anxiety tearing through my mind kept me awake. David was sleeping quietly beside me, his face as peaceful as a child's. I looked at him with a soft wistfulness. He'd been so preoccupied lately that our conversations had been kept to a minimum. Sometimes I felt less like a wife and more like a caregiver. I crawled carefully out of bed, careful not to disturb his sleep. I threw on a warm robe and headed for the kitchen. The cold air greeted me as if enveloping me in its coolness, and the faint light over the stove illuminated the countertop. I turned on the coffee maker and leaned against the counter, watching as drops of coffee began to fill the clear pitcher. The silence was pleasant, peaceful, but it also hid an uneasiness I couldn't drown out. Thinking about Calvin was a mistake, but every little thing reminded me of him. His gaze, that incident in the bedroom, his awkward but oddly touching attempt to act like nothing had happened. I was distracted from my thoughts when I heard a quiet rustle. Barefoot footsteps on the parquet. Turning around, I saw Calvin. He walked into the kitchen, disheveled, wearing his usual faded t-shirt and sweatpants. His hair was still damp from his shower, some strands of it sloppy, and for some reason that detail made me stare at him longer than I should have. He threw me a brief but warm smile, walked over to the refrigerator and pulled out a bottle of water. His movements were lazy, like he was enjoying his casual morning. I noticed him leaning against the counter and glanced at me. "Good morning," I said, feeling my heart clench with nervous tension. Calvin didn't say anything back, just smiled, and then walked past me, close enough for me to feel the warmth of his body. The gesture was barely noticeable, but it stayed in the air, leaving an invisible trail. When David woke up, I had already finished making breakfast. There were scrambled eggs and toast on the table, coffee for my husband, and I made a smoothie for myself, trying to focus on the usual rituals. David, as always, was the last to arrive. He looked casual, but too neat for his morning routine. Hair neatly combed, t-shirt changed to a clean one. The three of us sat down at the table. The clinking of cutlery and David's quiet voice discussing his plans for the day filled the space. But underneath all that ordinariness lurked tension. Every time Calvin passed me salt or touched his hand to mine, I felt my breath hitch. It was unintentional, accidental, but it was in little things like that that the threat lurked. Under the table, I suddenly felt his foot lightly touch mine. The movement was too light to be considered an accident. My hand shook involuntarily, spilling a drop of coffee onto the tablecloth. I looked up, but Calvin was already eating quietly, as if nothing had happened. After breakfast, David retired to the study, leaving me with the chores as usual. Usually Calvin disappeared too, but today he offered to help. It was unexpected, and I barely hid my surprise. "No need, I can handle it," I said, putting the dirty plates in the sink. "I want to help." His voice sounded calm, but there was something in it that made me freeze. We cleaned up together in silence. His presence was strangely comfortable, but also anxiety-creating. I tried to avoid his gaze, concentrating on my work, but at some point our hands met as I reached for a glass. I felt the warmth of his skin. The moment was brief but electric. I pulled back quickly, trying not to give away my emotions, but Calvin held his gaze on me longer than he should have. When he left, I was alone. My hand still felt his touch, and my mind throbbed with questions I was afraid to seek answers to. It was a game I didn't want to start, but somehow I couldn't stop. The kitchen, where a few minutes ago everything had seemed so familiar, was now a stage full of hidden meaning. And I knew that all of this was a road that led to destruction. When everyone had gone to their rooms, the house fell back into its usual routine. I, alone in the kitchen, continued to clear the table of the evening's leftovers. The groceries were stacked in the refrigerator, and the washed dishes returned to the shelves with a quiet splash. At that moment a strange feeling came over me. Suddenly I was not in my own life, but as if someone else had inexorably cut the film of time and left only a shadow of the past. I remembered how once, dressed in a light summer dress, with a carefree smile I was walking towards my husband. We were young, full of enthusiasm and tenderness. So many years had passed since that time, and the feelings seemed to have evaporated like spring fog. Trapped under the weight of everyday life, I closed my eyes and tried to remember those moments of happiness, when his arms wrapped around my waist and I could feel the warmth of love all around us. It was strange how over the years it became harder and harder to find the connection. Time seemed frozen in our home, but emotions boiled up inside me, demanding an outlet. It was in these moments that dreams of intimacy with him became too vivid, sometimes even painful. Suddenly, there was a noise from the living room in the silence. I paused when I heard his voice. "Kathy, where's my notebook?" A moment, and melancholy hung in the air. My husband, with his passion for order, was still the dependable man I had always admired. But this habit made me smile. What had we traded romance for? I thought back to that evening, when we'd been cozying up on the couch, watching TV. The light from the screen softly illuminated his features, creating an atmosphere of intimacy. My heart sank at the way he casually embraced me, letting me smell the scent of his warm body. But that moment passed quickly, and soon he drifted off to sleep, leaving me alone with my growing feelings and philosophy of life. The sounds outside the window intensified. The wind was raging, as if looking for a way out of the confined space. I knew it was only a few seconds before the sound of footsteps crumbling across the black matte tiles of the kitchen. As I walked past, I noticed the door slightly ajar, and my heart jumped with excitement. When I entered, I saw a cozy setting. Oil hand candles burning on the table cast a warm glow, creating a dreamy atmosphere that took my breath away. There were rolls on the table, my favorite. Calvin stood next to them, 2 glasses of red wine in his hand, and his pants looked like they were about to slide down. His slight smirk was both playful and seductive, as if he had just been harboring the secrets of our last night. I was blinded with emotion. Scraps of gentle nostalgia and mystery were in the air. I froze under his gaze, the sparkle I'd been searching for so long. He stepped closer, slowly placed his hand on my face, and gently stroked my cheek. In that moment, it was as if the world around me disappeared. All that was left was him, his warmth, and our long silent understanding. My heart throbbed at the label of tenderness, and I felt my breath catch. I wanted to answer him, but the words stuck in my throat, leaving only a sort of warm shiver. I went back to doing the dishes, unable to shake off his presence. Longing and hope combined, and I realized how much I wanted to hold him, to be closer than I'd ever been. He pushed the culinary misunderstanding again and decided to raise his glass, as if calling for some mysterious toast. I accepted his wine and he kept his eyes on me as I took a sip, feeling a sweet warmth flowing down my throat. This simple but depth-filled scene suddenly opened up new horizons between us. The prospect of possibilities and tender moments overwhelmed me, and I felt my senses returning. Perhaps every moment could be the beginning of a new chapter in our love, but it was up to us to dare to let go of the shell of everyday life and let our feelings flare up again, like the unquenchable flame of the candles burning on the table. It was as if I were standing on the edge of a precipice, and despite my deep anxiety, gripped by fear, I wanted to take a step forward. Calvin continued to stare at me, his eyes sparkling with sincerity and persistence. I, on the other hand, could feel the contradictions actively raging inside me. "You don't understand, if my husband ever finds out," a thought crept in, but I shut myself off again, contrary to the fact that I'd understood everything for a long time. Calvin's words hit me hard. "He doesn't notice you anymore." The phrase left an unpleasant residue, for it brought up a truth I'd been trying not to touch. Closing my eyes, I tried to gather my thoughts, but the sight of Calvin, his insistent presence close to me, seemed to take away the last reserve of confidence. "This isn't just wrong, it's impossible," I said, sure I couldn't explain it. But he took a step closer, still looking at me questioningly and kindly. "Why? Are you afraid of people's opinions, their judgment?" His voice became softer, and I felt everything inside me turn over. I looked away, too vulnerable for such questions. I wanted to pull away, but I knew this moment would be with us forever. Complex emotions overwhelmed me. Guilt, fear, longing. "I don't understand," I whispered, my head down. Calvin, as if begging, asked me to explain my torment, but I couldn't find the words to describe the inner battle that went beyond a simple explanation. Instead, I just shook my head and decided it was probably best to leave. I walked quickly out of the kitchen, closing the door behind me and stopping in front of it, letting the surging feelings escape me. With each passing minute, the certainty that this wasn't the end grew stronger inside. The emotions of this impossible, dangerous connection were tearing me apart, and my thoughts about the future were becoming more and more confusing. He grinned, his tone becoming more serious. "Fair enough, but don't you ever get tired of taking care of everyone? When was the last time someone took care of you? Aren't you happy with him?" Those words were like a sharp knife, and I clutched the folded towel to my chest as if it could shield me from his penetrating gaze. Calvin, I don't think this is a conversation we should be having. I tried again to steer us away from the topic, not wanting to wallow in lofty feelings, but he seemed to have no intention of giving up. Why not? He asked quietly, leaning against the door frame. He looked so relaxed, but there was determination burning in his eyes. I could feel him scrutinizing every part of me, and my grip was losing its firmness. You carry this house, you hold everything together while the rest of us just accept without noticing your hard work. Don't you deserve a little bit of self-care? His words broke through my defenses. I shook my head, continuing to back away until I hit the wall. Calvin, whatever this is, it has to stop, I said, feeling tears gather in my eyes, and this time it was a real, majestic urge. He reached out and touched mine gently, and the world around me suddenly became shaky. Even such a simple gesture caused an overwhelming sensation inside. Saying something vague, I just stood there, drawn in by his warmth. Tell me you don't feel it. His words rang out like songs I couldn't help but respond to. I opened my mouth to respond, but there was no way the words danced on my tongue. Inside me, I knew the only fact that there was more than affection between us, and that feeling wasn't going away. Each moment, as if in slow motion, grew stronger between us, and I realized that these feelings could no longer be locked within the confines of a single cabin on the edge of the road. Thinking about the new house he'd proposed seemed tempting. Two trembling souls seeking understanding. Perhaps it was exactly what we needed, but fear of the unknown clutched me tighter and tighter. At the threshold of a new life, I stopped, realizing that every decision could change our existence forever. And it became even more clear that despite all the hesitations and feelings, one thing remained true. This bond would not allow us to separate. The night shrouded me in its darkness, but my heart was still racing. I lay on the cold sheets, the weight of doubt and struggle weighing down on me like a mountain, hand in hand with the inexorable memories. Calvin's words echoed in every corner of my mind, filling the space where once there had been only love. Now instead there was only darkness, making it hard to breathe and filling me with fear. I felt lost, like a little girl dreaming of simple pleasures, the embrace of a lover, a hearty laugh, and carefree happiness. But instead, all I saw around me was Calvin, and hearing about him was almost excruciating. He was ready to give tenderness and willingness, but inside I knew his sincerity might be false. The thought tormented me like a painful reminder that I was only playing a dangerous game. Resting my head back on the pillow, I reached for the fleeing thoughts and, with them, realized the truth. It was wrong. I couldn't forgive myself for it. I remembered the words of my psychologist. She always said it's important to go back to what brought you to love, to find sincerity and embrace those feelings anew. Try falling in love with your husband again. I thought I could hear her voice, like an echo going back to the source. Calvin understood my pain. He could feel my lack of light. But there was no comfort in his understanding. He couldn't replace someone who was so important to me, even when the light of his presence seemed too bright. I thought more often of our past with my husband, of the promises he had made to me. I didn't want to be a traitor. I didn't want the troubling thoughts of Calvin to go against the warm memories of evenings together and dreams of the future. Maybe I should just start by trying to recapture the happiness we'd had, to make life meaningful and joyful instead of hidden passions. I asked myself the question I've been trying to keep from myself for the past year. Will I be able to love again? It would be a long process, requiring tremendous strength and effort, but if I tried sincerely, could it be true love? As I gathered my strength, I felt the weight gradually begin to recede. I realized that I could handle it. I would take a step back and allow myself to open the doors of happiness to start loving anew the one who continued to be there for me. Even if other feelings began to sprout in my life, I closed my eyes and sighed. The road ahead was full of doubts and difficulties, but I was ready to take it. Realizing that I hadn't allowed myself passions for a long time, I made a promise to myself: no secrets, no lies. I was choosing openness and truth. I was choosing my husband and the world we had built together. By going back to my roots, I hoped that as I fell in love anew, I could leave Calvin behind as a memory that once was and still is an important lesson. With that thought, I fell asleep, bathed in the light of hope that things could still be fixed.